Welcome to another video from the Serious Games Initiative here at the Wilson Center. Now, as you may know, the Serious Games Initiative is celebrating 20 years, or our 20-year anniversary, and that is of us developing, researching, and convening great people around the pro-social impacts of gaming. Throughout the decades, our approach has focused more on amplifying science, policy, and public policy issues through the medium of games and some of our research that we do here, because we are a think tank here at the Wilson Center. Some of our game titles include exciting titles like the Budget Hero series and Fiscal Ship, which are about the federal budget. And then we have some recent games that focus on more of environmental policy, like our plastic pipeline game, which has won a Games for Change award recently. And then also AI's Anatomy and a couple of other suites about our everyone's favorite topic of AI. But we also really try to focus on supporting the broader community of practice through our work here at the Wilson Center. And we have put together this series not just to celebrate the Serious Games Initiative, but to celebrate serious games more broadly in the greater field, to look at the past of serious games, the present of serious games, and the future of serious games. And I have the great fortune today of being joined by Constance Steinkuehler, who has a lengthy research agenda as well as working policy approach to serious games. But I'll let you introduce yourself if you would be so kind. So if you wouldn't mind telling us a little bit about how you orient towards serious games.
Sure, it's such a joy to be here with you. I started studying games somewhere back in like 2001, and there wasn't a lot of research on the medium. In fact, at that time, there was research that consisted of trying to evaluate games by nothing but looking at their boxes, right? Games were a little bit of a taboo topic in academic research. Now looking, back, gosh, that's almost 25 years ago. And you see like the proliferation, not just of really robust games research, looking at what are the impacts of games, whether it's commercial gameplay, that has been resituated for some positive outcomes, or whether it's games for impact that are built from the ground up for that impact. But it has just been kind of the golden age of research in many ways. Now games are kind of a standard form. They've even been integrated in ways where, for example, if you're studying flow, games would be used as the control condition because they're so useful at creating flow type conditions for players. But games are now sort of a not uncommon, certainly no longer a taboo topic for research. And what's even more exciting, well, actually, two things. One is, I'm very interested in education and um, really the kind of normalization of games as another medium that can be used in classrooms. That has completely happened, which is fantastic. And the third one is just the amount of development. I mean, now because game development platforms are more accessible and because academic researchers, non-for-profit researchers can actually work on projects, it's much more viable to build like a 2-hour game, a 20-hour game, and not necessarily have to compete with these ginormous budgets. There's a huge indie thriving scene. And so you see a lot of like really terrific games for impact that are on the open market and succeeding as businesses, which is very exciting. So I feel like, it's been a real blessing watching this kind of R&D really develop over the last 20 years or so. And of course, Wilson Center has been a huge part of that.
Well, thank you so much for that. But you were especially instrumental in getting folks like the Wilson Center booted up with our Serious Games Initiative. Could you describe a little bit about your thinking back 2 decades ago or so? What were you doing at that time? How did you, I'm trying to very gently hint that you might have a policy background here. So could you describe a little bit about your journey with serious games?
Sure, of course. I mean, so I was working under James Paul G, who of course put out a book that had kind of seismically shifted our conversations, particularly in education, but in higher education more broadly, to take games seriously as a medium. And it was a pretty risky endeavor when he did it, but it just made a huge splash. And I was a grad student and later, like kind of an older grad student at that time. But he had advised me. I had been working on these projects with sort of DoD type grants and looking at, I'm very interested in social interaction and cognition. And so I was looking at it in the context of chat rooms and other spaces, but struggling because it's hard to understand what people are capable of doing when they're not engaged in what they're actually asked to do, the tasks they're asked to accomplish together. So Jim had recommended to me to shift to games as a way to kind of eliminate this confounding problem of just, well, the fact that we were running trials and experiments, but the activities we were giving were hardly representative of what people can do when they're invested in what they're trying to solve or do together. So I did. And at the time, it was considered kind of a career killer. But I will say the chance to deal with such a creative medium was really provocative to me, and I really loved being able to do some kind of empirical research, but in an environment, in a kind of ecosystem that included a lot of creative talent. I'm a big believer that having artists and theater people around in any kind of project is just a huge boon. So I did a lot of my first work um, looking at online games and kind of, trying to make sort of trying to, sort of step back and ask the public to think about like the facts and data about what do we know about games, where are they problematic, but also where could they be really productive. And I think because there really wasn't a lot of work out of that kind that was looking at commercial gameplay, looking at all ages, and looking at the cognitive intellectual demands of the games, I think that my work kind of scratched an itch, so to speak, for the public, and then of course for policy. So I did get involved in policy. I served as the first kind of video game expert in the White House. I worked in the Office of Science and Technology Policy, which is the office inside the White House that advises on policy related to, among other things, technology. So I worked on that kind of policy work in DC and then in partnership outside of it for a couple years. And it was really pretty wonderful to do. I mean, the thing that I have so many good stories to tell about that work, but it was really inspiring. I mean, you're talking about civil servants who are willing to give up, companies, careers, stop everything to go serve their country. And it's one of the most humbling things I've ever seen, like being surrounded by such incredibly brilliant people who are willing to, work at like half a normal salary sometimes in order to serve their country. And I find that very, very inspiring. And of course, now 20 years later, 25 years later, we have various organizations that have really helped buoy up the field of games for impact. In fact, I would just say games generally, like taking games seriously as a medium in the same way we would take film or television seriously. We would want to think about, what are these media good for and for whom and when and under what conditions? And what kind of work could they do for us as a democracy, as a citizenry, as a global population, even? And I find those questions today still really endure. We still, I feel like we've gotten over that kind of hype cycle where it's like everyone's super excited and then they're super upset because in 18 months we didn't accomplish everything we wanted. But now what we have is now at least a good 10 years in this sort of, what Gartner would call that plateau of productivity, where you have this indie scene of games that include all sorts of titles that are on serious subjects, that are intended or not necessarily intended, but do have positive impact. And the player base they're so open to indie games. There's not this kind of what I would call like a pink ghetto where games for impact are now in this pink ghetto. That doesn't really exist anymore. There's just games, and there's good games or not as good of games. So I feel like it's been a really exciting and productive last decade, really, I would say, of getting games out that address that aren't just entertainment and fun, which they are, of course, but also, are transformative for human relationships, transformative for our understanding, can be transformative for public service and our public sort of world and sphere, and also are kind of normalized in spaces like institutions. So, Now we have many game design programs. That's not uncommon on major universities. It's also not uncommon for teachers to use games to illustrate systems that are very hard to describe and understand through just, say, a textbook. So I feel like we're sitting in such a great place 20 years later. It's really inspiring.
It's gone from something taboo that's something that is more openly embraced, including in academic institutions like you're currently serving at,
Yeah.
where, yeah. Where do you think the field is going from here? What do you think is the next big thing for serious
Oh
games?
gosh, predicting the future is so hard, right?
Yeah, get on
I
our
can tell
crystal
you where I
balls.
would love it to go. I mean, I would love it to go toward these really big, weighty questions that I think every American kind of feels the burden of right now. I think that games that do more that connect us and build trust and belonging rather than separate us and create division. I think that that is a space that games have this incredible, incredible power to connect people across all sorts of identities and all sorts of commitments that are outside the game. Games have this real potency there, and I would love to see some real work in that space. Both digital games, analog games, all the forms. I mean, I would point to some incredible work like Dan Cook's work on kind games, where he's organized this group of commercial game developers and designers to think about how do we make games that actually build trust among players? And I don't mean games where you know See, I don't necessarily mean games that are like Eve for Everyone or Stardew Valley, which I love, or Animal Crossing, which I love. I mean games that use what we know about the basics of sociology and how trust happens, like repeated safe interactions, right? Like some of the less not ideological, just sort of, like how do you create a space where people feel like they're safe and like they can trust each other enough not to like have horrible insults hurled. I think that's one space that I love seeing more development in. And I would love also for us to bend games and games for impact toward, again, some of these really tough national problems. We have, you know, Americans are not all equally understanding about how a democracy works. Many of the feedback functions in a democracy, if you thought about it like a game, it's a horribly broken game. Like it's very hard to understand how to participate or to see the impacts of participation, especially when those impacts happen at an aggregated level. I love the idea of more games, just like what Wilson Center sort of launched with, which was, the game on the federal budget, thinking about games that might help the public understand our own governance systems that are otherwise pretty opaque and they're complicated. They're not easy to understand. And so I think that both the social agenda and then also sort of for me, the kind of democracy and engagement in being a good, like engaging in civic participation and being a good citizen, right? What does that
Hmm.
mean? How do we cultivate that? How do we convey understanding and how those systems work and also inspire people, to kind of make that kind of engagement cool again? I would say it's always cool, but I'm a nerd, so I don't know that
I
that
think
works
I yeah, I
everywhere.
think we're a little biased. We're like, yeah, civic engagement has always been cool,
Yeah.
guys.
Yeah.
But that's a really valuable insight in how we can use games to both promote and engage
Yeah.
core issues within games, but how also games might be able to be used to sort of provide a feedback cycle. Is
Yeah.
yeah, that's really cool. Are there any projects that you're working on right now that sort of feed into that line?
Oh my gosh. Yes, I have to say. So we just finished a study that was about, I guess it's been about 3 years working on it, looking at, I've always focused on I'm very interested in social interaction, what people do together. I adore studying people in groups, especially. So, we did a study that was on sort of the darker side of online games because I've spent so much time looking at the benefits. So, looking at things like toxicity and hate speech and what happens in commercial games when people are persistently exposed to this kind of behavior. Like, when do they drop out? How do they respond? What are the consequences? And also looking at things like, Does exposure to hate normalize hate? And it turns out, yeah, it does, right? It does normalize it. So after that, I'm an educator at heart, and I like focusing on solutions. So if I'm going to talk about a problem, I like to talk about a solution. So now I've been sort of pivoting my work and doing more of trying to do kind of an analysis of what are the programs that are out there that are targeting specifically like normalizing social relationships across race lines, across power differences. Some of the greatest, can I just like talk about a program or two?
Yeah, of course.
So I'll give you an example. So I'm here in California. I'm at University of Irvine, California. There is a program happening at San Quentin, maximum security. It's now a rehabilitation center, not just a prison. And there is an incarcerated, individually led organization that is using games, and they've been doing this for almost 2 years now. It's called San Quentin Skunk Works. And some incarcerated individuals decided to start doing these monthly game events as a way for incarcerated prisoners and sometimes guards to play together in a space where they could, for a while, set aside some of the self segregation that happens racially on, like, the open yard for activity, or some of the power, the incredible power differences between a guard and someone who's incarcerated. And there's been some great press, like in the LA Times, about these programs. What they're trying to do is totally incredible and so obvious. And yet, when you see it, you think it's so obvious, and yet so few people are doing it. They're just creating a space where people can just sort of like drop all the pretenses and all of their sort of outside identities and come in and just spend a couple hours together. For example, with, you know, with correction officers and incarcerated people, like playing checkers together, or
Hmm.
partnering to battle another, guard inmate team in chess or checkers, or having like role playing games like D&D variants where, where, where incarcerated individuals that are in different gangs, different, racially segregated, can actually spend a few hours just hanging out together. And I will say, I was just up there a few weeks ago, and these events are so potent for the participants. And they're so provocative in the way that they sort of offer an alternative version of what we might think of as, like, could we just at some point kind of normalize some relationships? So there's some really incredible efforts like that out there that are having significant impacts in places that you would think having impact would be so difficult, right? Like, can you imagine a harder case than correction officers and incarcerated individuals in a maximum security prison? So if they can accomplish this through such vastly different, subgroups in the population, if they can do that inside a maximum security prison and have incredible success, imagine what we could do if we just sort of like, re-embraced play as a space for us to treat one another with a kind of dignity and joyfulness, and instead of being what we often feel, which is increasingly afraid. So
Yeah,
there's
no, the capacity for play to like build bridges across,
yes.
allow people to
Yes,
sort of set their biases at the door. Yeah,
absolutely. And it's not always about forming best friendships. Sometimes it's about reminding ourselves that we all have enough shared pleasure in the same kind of activities, and that we're all similar enough that, none of us are nothing but a political viewpoint. None of us are nothing but our worst mistake. People are complicated and they're pretty amazing. So it's really wonderful to see events and organizations start to, kind of bubble up to the top, that are using games as a space just for us to be together again. And I think that that's really an incredible thing that games do without really even having to try, right?
yeah. No, that's a very inspirational story. Thank you so much for sharing it. And we'll provide some links down below for some of the sources that you've cited throughout. And if you have any research that you would like us to also include, we're happy to do that.
Oh, that's
So,
fantastic.
well, thank you so much. I wish I could talk to you for another hour, but I want to be respectful of your time and Thank you so much for joining us today to talk about some of your work, some of your insights into the history of serious games, and I can't wait to see what comes out of your lab next.
Oh, Elizabeth, it's such a pleasure. And thank you for being such an incredible leader in this space. The work you're doing is just incredible. I'm so glad to be part of it.
Everyone, have a great day.